Good. We're now going to give industry a chance to respond to the presentations from the representatives of the EU institutions. We have Steve Cromar, who's chair of the Well Experts Committee at OGP, the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. Mr. Cromar is himself an engineer, so I think he'll have some very interesting perspective from someone who's been at the sharp end of safety regulation. Steve.
Yeah, let me explain my position. I'm a chief engineer at ConocoPhillips in the UK. So I actually use the legislation in order to permit wells, to train people, to make sure that all the operations which I'm in control of actually are operated safely. So if you like, I'm the end user of this legislation, the person who has to make it all fit and work. So this is my perspective. I'll try to be brief. So first of all, OGP. You may not be familiar with OGP, but Oil and Gas Producers is one of only 2 organizations which are recognized by the G20 as representing the oil and gas industry. The other organization is IADC for the drillers. We have 70 members, and that includes most of the oil and gas explorers and producers, also the small independents and the national oil companies. The service sector, companies like Halliburton, Baker Hughes, all those are all members. And we have 15 national associations, including API. IADC, so the previous one that I mentioned, which is recognized by the G20, I'm also a member of us. OLF, etc., Oil and Gas UK. So basically we have the whole of the industry, the largest organization within the industry. We've got an organization in London and Brussels. So, first of all, let us state that we like a lot of the elements of the proposed legislation. There are many areas where we really support them, and some of you have actually collected this reports which we've handed out. This is a report that was produced by the Global Industry Response Group as a response to Macondo, Montara and others. And a lot of the findings which are in this for our global organisation are also common to the proposed legislation. We have fundamental values to all of us. All of us, I would respectfully suggest, is also the politicians. We've all got common aims. The operators do not want to have a spill. The legislators don't want to have a spill. The regulators don't want to have a spill. We'll all be in trouble if we have a spill, so we all have common aims. And that's the common aim of us, is to try to make sure that we all manage it properly and make sure we get the right form of legislation which would put it together. So we've formed 3 independent groups under OGP. Prevention, let me just point here. Prevention, that's the one that I'm in charge of, Wells Expert Committee, and in my humble opinion, that's the most important, of course. Intervention and response. So prevention is to prevent a spill happening in the first place. In my humble opinion, that's where all the money should be spent. If we prevent it happening, we don't need the intervention, the capping stacks and the cutting machines and dealing with all of these things that we've seen on TV. And of course the response to deal with oil and water and how to burn it and that sort of thing. But we've invested a lot of money, the industry has invested a lot of money in all of these 3 initiatives. In prevention, we have produced a whole bunch of reports. On well control, we've actually produced an improved set of well control guidelines to train people to make sure that they're following the right things. The previous well control training and competency was out of date, so we've improved that. We have now put a set of lessons learned into place. There's a database being formed up by OGP. Industry, if they have an accident or an incident, they will report it to our database, and it is now shared with the rest of the industry. That is an operation. We promised that to the regulators, and we have delivered on that promise. We're working with Aberdeen University and working on human factors training. Now, human factors is the ability of people to speak up when there's something wrong, when they see something wrong. You know, if you see something wrong, you have an option. You can keep your mouth shut and just hope it goes away, and in many cases nothing turns to it. Or you can speak up and say, I'm not happy with that. There's something that I don't understand. Explain this to me more. That's the human factors which we need to get involved. Because in all of these reports, presidential reports, that was brought up as an issue. People knew there was something wrong and they didn't do anything about it. So that human factors study has been done with Aberdeen University. We will produce a training course, but we will also produce a method of evaluating people's ability to do that. And they must pass that exam before they're allowed to go ahead and do work. BOP reliability study, we're doing a study on blowout preventers, the thing that was famous in Macondo, which everyone said failed, but in reality possibly didn't. Not fully understood by a lot of people. So we're going to look at reliability, we're going to look at how we can actually have a universal way of working out how reliable a BOP stack is. That is in place, it's being worked, we're working to international standards on that. ISO is our standards. All of this should be turned into international standards because an ISO is a global standard. The world will be working on it. It's one of the objectives of the legislation is to put everything into a global standard. And that is how we can achieve this. So the work of OGP is working with the ISO committee to develop these industry standards. And what we want the regulator to do is ask people simply to work to those standards. We've produced 4 capping stacks. I think that's in the next slide yet. We've got excuse me, press the wrong button. Go back. This is a capping stack. We're producing 4 of those, locating them around the world under OGP's control. This other one here is the Osprag capping stack. There's actually 10 capping stacks being produced around the world by different organizations, and they exist today. Now that's another example of how the industry can move fast and keep its promises to change the industry as required. And finally, the response and dispersants. I think we've got some more. This is training people up to deal with response, how to clean it, mobilize people, etc. So we want to build on existing expertise in the countries which we have. And we believe the best way to do that is a directive. The problem with a regulation is it will divert too many competent people away from the business of dealing with safety today. Now, I'm not only talking about the oil companies and the service companies. I'm also concerned about the regulator. The regulators are struggling to keep up with the amount of activity which we have. And if we bring in a whole new series of legislation, which means that we have to do a whole bunch of submissions, they have to review it, they don't approve it, they check it over and agree with it as it's acceptable, they will have to divert their attention from doing inspections and bringing people up. So we'll actually take our eyes off the ball. And the biggest worry for me is that with all these people, these experts in the industry being taken off of the actual job that we're doing, something could fall through the cracks and we could have an incident. So we believe a directive is a much better way to allow existing systems to marry into the EU objectives. So the better form would be a directive. We don't want to rewrite the existing stuff, I said that. Focus on enhancing safety. You know, if we bring in this regulation, we'll spend 5 years getting it all into the right format for the EU, and we will end up exactly the same place as we are today, but with different paperwork in place. We'll have lost 5 years of moving forward on safety. That's my biggest concern. How was our time?
Perfect. Steve, thank you very much. Okay. Our final panellist this evening is Paul Frisvold. He corrected me quite rightly for pronouncing his name wrong. Not a fluent, not any kind of Norwegian speaker. Paul Frisvold is chairman of Bellona Europe, which is the European office of the Norwegian Environmental Campaign Group. Steve. Paul.
Thank you very much, Simon. And if Steve could pass on this one, and I can put on my slide. Ups. So, good evening, everybody. And as Steve said, he is the end user of this legislation. I thought I would point out that Bellona, along with a series of other civil society representatives, such as Seas at Risk, Oceana, Greenpeace, Client Earth. We like to look at ourselves as the end consequence of this legislation. Because after all, I think it's a fairly common understanding that there is a significant risk out there for a major oil and gas accident. We have seen it in Europe, unfortunately, many times. We have seen it obviously in the Mexican Gulf, which is the source of the initiative of this new legislation. And right there is exactly why we believe that there is a very important case for an EU-wide regulation, notably because it can allow the other countries who luckily have not had these accidents to learn and to gain from the experience that the advanced countries have. And so that we hope that they will not have to go through the same painful learning as these countries with the damage to nature and indeed to human beings. I think I'd just like to say also that there are really two things that are important for us. It's accountability and independence. I think if you look through the legislative initiative, if you look through the debate, it often comes up that there is unclarity about who is liable for what. I mean, where does the buck stop, as President Eisenhower said once? I mean, where is that liability? We see that there is a high degree of fragmentation in the existing legislation, and there is a need, therefore, for a clear set of who is accountable. So accountability is a major part of this. In addition to what Ivo Bellet talked about, independence of authorities. I come from a small country, Norway, but in that small country we have a huge industry. And that's good because it generates wealth to the Norwegian government and society. But it also, we also see that there is a very closely knitted contacts. It's a small country, so the difference between industry, government are not always as perfect as we would see it. So we actually believe a new set of eyes are important for countries such as Norway, where we have this web of interdependence between the government and the industry. But I should say that we are, as an environmental organization, very much impressed with what the industry has already achieved. We are impressed with the tripartite organization that they have, the way that they develop new legislation. We are, and we think that is important to allow these practices to continue, which is why we also agree that the good part of this is it's a minimum legislation. That is indeed important to us. And then just to say that, well, we do respect the, when Steve talks about we don't want to divert the attention of the scarce resources. And we also see in a country like Norway, where the scarcity of resources is not our highest problem, but there is in fact a scarcity of resources in the Petroleum Inspectorate. And only to comply with this legislation, it seemed clear that they would have to receive additional resources from the Norwegian government and indeed bolster their administration. So yes, there is an administrative burden. But when you look at all the other areas of safety that the European Union has been through lately, I mean, we have maritime, we have with the Erika, Prestige, we have aviation, road, rail. In every field where the European Union have legislated, we have seen similar arguments being used, that it's bureaucratic, it's cumbersome, and so forth. And it is. But hopefully with experience we could do it better and swifter. But nevertheless, we don't believe that that is the main obstacle. Now, I just want to point out 3 or 4 areas where we, to address some of the issues very quickly, Simon. First of all, about the regulation. We understand there is a difference, but we do see in real life how many EU countries have had difficulties to live up to the contents and allow them to enforce the contents of other directives. And particularly when we looked at Jan's map on the screen, that was very symbolic, I think, to see how many countries who are in the process of develop a petroleum industry. And the capacity, the capacity of these countries' administration to put in place viable, good, solid mechanisms might not be there. And that is why we believe a regulation can assist and can be more helpful, in fact, to have minimum rules. Also, the fact that they will be minimum rules is important, which I already mentioned. And as I put on the screen here, no transposition delays or deficits. We talked about the oversight. We spoke about the necessity that some countries do not have the facilities available, and the additional eyes that we say, which we believe would be good not only for those countries with insufficient resources, but indeed those countries where the petroleum sector is highly dominant. So I shall not dwell on that. But this is an important issue, the financial security. Back again to my native country, Norway, where there is I would say a euphoria might be an insufficient expression to illustrate how enthusiastic the industry is about new oil and gas drilling. And we see the emergence of many, many small companies that are actually would not at all have the capacity, have the financial capacity to pay for a major accident. So we believe this could be strengthened, Ivo Brett, and we believe there's a good case for strengthening that in the proposed text. And then you mentioned the Arctic. We heard today that Total has now stopped its exploration activities because of difficulties with arranging the cap that is supposed to lie over the drilling holes. That is very...
Shell.
What did I say?
You mean Total.
Okay, I mean Shell. Sorry. I meant Shell. Thank you. So that shows, it illustrates how difficult it is. Total has actually expressed concern that in Stavanger at the Offshore Northern Seas conference this summer, they expressed they're concerned. So the Arctic is difficult. There was a ship, a passenger ship, that went down in the Antarctic, and they have to wait for 8 months before they can clean up the oil. So obviously, the low temperature, the darkness, the very specific conditions in the Arctic, they pose a series of issues that we believe need to be addressed, and that's why we think it's a good idea that the EU should work with neighboring countries to limit the risk of accidents, and that it actually demands a specific set of measures. Finally, the external dimension, I believe, was left out in the final suggestion by the Commission. People raise the objective that this is difficult to enforce, and indeed it would be a novelty. But there are other areas of EU legislation where we do see that there is a global enforcement mechanism embedded in waste legislation, in security of fishing vessels being discussed these days. So there are absolutely places where we have experiencing in global enforcement. And Steve mentioned the importance of workers being able to say what's wrong, the whistleblower effect. And we believe the whistleblower effect is a key right of and part to the whole cooperation between government, industry, and workers. And if that is important in Europe, we believe it would be equally important in Nigeria, in South Africa, in South America, and so forth, where we see political regimes that would usually not allow for such a basic right. That issue have been, so I will not address that, but indeed I mentioned that in the beginning about transparency. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't mean to cut you off quite so abruptly, but